Can everyone hear me on Zoom? All right.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank everyone who's in attendance today, and for all the people that have already presented, and of course for Lhasa and for Latrobe for hosting this. My name is Ben Arias. I'm a PhD student at Tulane University, and the presentation that I'm going to give right now is "The Pig is Proof: Ignorance, Ecological Imperialism, and Colonial Repetition in Latin America and Oceania." I guess I'll introduce my research background right now. The sort of methodology that I tend to focus on more is the Annales School, which is a French school of thought that emphasizes two main points, which is history viewed as a longue durée, which is more of like a long duration. So instead of focusing on history as periods, it's more viewing history as in terms of a continuous long duration. And that's especially important in the study of imperialism and ecologically, especially since those effects that those sort of consequences that took place continue to this day. And so by viewing imperialism as an ongoing sequence, we're better able to perform greater analysis, for example. And then the second point is this sort of idea of the French word mentalités, which in English roughly translates to mentality, which is sort of identifying the rationale within the sort of mental perspective of historical actors to sort of extrapolate the sort of reasoning behind how actors are the way they are, for example. And so, sort of to give a slight introduction, historians tend to ascribe certain levels of agency when conducting their analyses normally in order to sort of reach a conclusion. You sort of see the example of X does something that leads to Y that then leads to Z, for example, with X being the sort of main perpetrator in that scenario. And then within that tendency, for example, I wanted to try and identify the line between agency and intentionality. So, for example, yes, a certain actor made the decision, but what is the line between that person's intentionality and how much did they see that sort of thing they wanted to do or create sort of extend beyond what they actually did, for example? And this question becomes particularly challenging in the case of the pig, because the pig is an unsolicited actor who assumes its own agency in the wild, for example. Yet it doesn't have that same sort of intentionality as a human, for example, would sort of have, because it doesn't see beyond the immediate perception that they have, for example. They mostly think about their survival, whereas humans sort of tend to think beyond their circumstances sometimes. So therefore, I wanted to understand the rationale within the cases of the introduction of the pig to North America and Oceania, specifically New Zealand and Australia in the cases of Oceania, because it certainly was not deductive reasoning. And I like to make the joke that there was no established sort of colonial rule book, for example, particularly in the case of the British, who would never dare to follow the example of the Spaniards just because of how prominent the Black legend was at the time. And instead, ecological imperialism becomes a question of inductive reasoning, and the inductive reasoning of the colonizers' mentalite towards the lands that Europeans colonized. So where I find the purpose of my research is by asking, how does the pig represent the mentality of the colonizers and its impacts in ecology? So my research question is, what do feral pigs reveal about the relationship between agency and ecological imperialism through the analysis of mentalite across Latin America and Oceania? And I argue that by comparing these two reasons, the paper demonstrates that ecological imperialism was a structural feature of European colonialism, whose consequences make ignorance culpable through their mentalite, and that while European colonists may not have foreseen the precise long-term effects of their actions in terms of the effects that their implementation of ecology onto different lands, what those effects were, they fully understood that they were participating in systems of dispossession and transformation by acting with clear awareness of their immediate impacts and with full responsibility. And so now I sort of want to turn to bring in some literature that have helped me sort of conceptualize my research and also set the sort of foundation for it. So in terms of historiography, the sort of first established book that sets the precedent for the studies of ecological imperialism is Alfred Crosby's Ecological Imperialism, The Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 and 1900. And the thing is that Crosby sort of sets the foundation by saying that, yes, there are other realms of imperialism that exist beyond just humans. It also manifests within the ecology. Yet, Anna Tsing, for example, promotes the idea that ecology isn't linear. For example, you don't introduce a certain ecological policy and get a linear result. For example, instead, ecology becomes messy. As I was saying before, the pig is an unsolicited actor because it takes its own agency in the wild through its feral transformation. And then Tom Van Duren identifies the effects of pigs on native bird loss, for example. So he directly identifies that case. But what I try to do is sort of expand the case of the pig beyond just a sort of identifying its effect on native ecology to a sort of greater analysis that identifies both North America and Oceania. And then finally, Kyle White, who frames settler colonialism as an ongoing environmental violence, and I sort of try and conceptualize that within the example of the pig. So just to give a sort of a background on the pig itself, just so everyone's clear, the feral pig is the domesticated pig gone feral, and in this case, basically, it becomes wild. So feral pigs are native to Eurasia, and they sort of derive from the wild boar, and they're a domesticated version of that. But when they go into the wild, they sort of revert to that original state in which they used to live in nature, for example. And then they're mostly omnivores, with around 75 to 80% of their food being plants, but then they also are able to eat meat as well. One of the aspects that makes the pig such a threat to native ecology is the fact that they do have a lack of predators in the different ecological spaces where they are not native to. Specifically in America, wolves and dogs are one of the main predators, but just because of sort of the ecological destruction that has happened over such time, there is a decrease in wolves, for example, and in terms of Oceania as well, crocodiles are just barely being implemented by the Australian government to sort of combat pigs, just because they're finally recognizing that crocodiles do have the capacity. But that wasn't always the precedent, for example. And as well, dogs and humans are both cases in which pigs are susceptible to, for example. And then another aspect is that they have a very, very fast, rapid breeding cycle. Pigs can breed year-round and can produce 4 to 10 piglets between 12 to 15 months. And in the wild, they live roughly 4 to 8 years. So you can imagine the math. They can produce about 60 pigs in their lifetime, more or less, which just for those 2 pigs, it is a mass amount. And so there's the main distinction between the pig itself and its feral state is, you could see in the first image above, is that the pig in the left, for example, is a domesticated pig who is extremely overweight and has very thin fur compared to its counterpart, which is on the right, which is the feral pig, who's sort of developed a snout as well as very thick fur and has sort of developed more lean and muscle and has gone skinnier as well. So I take the first case study of feral pigs in North America. So feral pigs were first introduced to North America by Christopher Columbus, and this was done through a process called seeding, what Crosby calls seeding, which is to sort of plant these animals into the wild so they later go on to serve as a supply of meat for hunting. And this was then extended to Hispaniola through Cuba, from Hispaniola to Cuba, and then from there it was introduced by De Soto through Florida. And sort of, if you could see on the bottom right, you see the state of Florida, and then from there they expanded sort of into that southern range of the United States. And sort of the effects that have on the native ecology is that it plummeted the available food sources for native species such as deer, who had to begin to compete with the pigs, for example, for their food, mast, which comes from the native oak tree within North America. And also, in terms of that brought further complications by depleting the sort of food that was available for the deer, but then also it affected the deer itself in that it further spread diseases through the contamination of the plants as well. And it also created, finally, a new dependency for feral pigs, which also caused further implications simply because feral hogs do have the tendency to also latch onto parasites. And so, obviously, disease being one of the main factors, it led to other things such as the spread of influenza, which obviously caused huge implications within the settlements within North America, such as the case of Tenochtitlan and the fall of the Aztecs, which sort of facilitated colonization. And then, secondly, on the left, you see California, where mission efforts were further facilitated to a greater extent by the ecology that took place, simply because of the destruction of the ecology that European domesticated animals caused, like the pig, that also led to the destruction of the ecology that the native people depended on, which then further promulgated the mission efforts. And then in the case of Oceania, you see sort of the preceding processes carried out by Captain Cook, who was sort of the first Europeans to sort of come to Oceania. And so Captain Cook went to Tasmania specifically and introduced 2 pigs into the wild to sort of promulgate that sort of same process that took place in North America, and then later that expanded to Sydney. And so what some of the consequences you see is that it was later declared a pest species by the 1880s in New South Wales, just because of the sheer quantity. And then in New Zealand also you see the introduction of old world diseases through animals such as the pig, which also facilitated the colonization there as well, just because of the sheer depletion of people, as well as the spread of old world plants through the fecal matter of the pig. And so some of the similarities you see, just because I'm short on time, are intentional seeding, disease, the rapid spread of both of the pig in both cases, both in North America and Oceania, as well as the destruction of local ecology. What is sort of the mentality of the colonizer then? So the sort of mentality of the colonizers, that the ecological policy of the colonizer were driven by this mentality of assumed superiority of what they perceived as familiar. This fact is demonstrated in early colonization of Latin America, when the Spaniards believed their food to be superior to that of the indigenous people. This particular mentality is based on the mere exposure effect, and in sociology it's called the familiar principle, and what is already known is perceived as inherently superior. This mentality led to colonizers in both continents imposing their understanding of ecology, which evolved the subsequent subduing of another. So in this case, ignorance is not the absence of knowledge, but the refusal to consider it, and that is where the intentionality lies between sort of ignorance as not knowing and the deliberate decision to sort of reject other knowledge systems. And so the modern implications is that, for example, in North America, the feral pig costs $2.5 billion annually for the United States, and this is taken by the Department of Agriculture. And then in, for example, cases in Oceania, the pig remains a threat to native species. In New Zealand, for example, the native kiwi bird, since the bird cannot fly, it's susceptible to the pig and its eggs. So that in that way it disrupts the native ecology, as well as the disruption of conservation efforts in Australia and through agriculture, specifically sugarcane and lambs, for example. Those are the two main things it threatens, as well as the conservation efforts, just because they have the capacity to enter into spaces that are sort of deemed for conservation, but yet still intervene within the native ecology. And so the conclusion is that history analyzed through the mentalités occurs and reoccurs to show these sort of continual colonial structures. But what are those colonial structures based in? Those colonial structures are based in these sort of mentalities rather than sort of viewing them as isolated cases. And so in order to dismantle these sort of colonial structures that sort of maintain and persist until today, we must identify them and the way they produce knowledge on these sort of aspects such as ecology, and sort of demonopolize them and be able to introduce new knowledge systems, such as knowledge systems that are sort of native to those sort of continents that I've been talking about, and be able to produce more solutions that are able to sort of combat this sort of impending problem that ecology still produces to this day. Thank you.